Hello everyone, and welcome to a new series on my channel named RM History. Before I start this video, I would like to say, if there is any information that you know is wrong, I'm happy for you to correct in the comments, but I would like to see a source. With this said, let's get started with the video. A History of Chatham, an RM History production. Chapter 1. The Beginning. Up until the Roman invasion, Chatham was nameless. This doesn't mean that nobody lived there though. Many archaeological artifacts have been found in Chatham. An example is Drow Hill Wood in Luton. Many flint implements have been found there, suggesting that people lived in the area 500,000 to 100,000 years ago. Evidence of an elephant has also been found near where Upnor Castle now lies. This suggests large animals like elephants and mammoths lived in the area. When the Neolithic age came to an end about 4,000 years ago, the Celtic immigration began. With this, the Bronze Age started in Britain. Evidence of Celts living in Chatham has been found in the River Medway and during construction works in Chatham Dockyard. During this time, a road named Pilgrim's Way was formed. This road was formed because of migrating hordes attempting to cross through Chatham and its dangerous marshes. The path led along Long Hill Avenue to a settlement at Slickett's Hill. It then passed across the lines and down to the river at Lower Gillingham. Another path was formed which crossed the stream at the bottom of Church Street and then ascended to the Mount Road. It then entered Maidstone Road and followed that to Bluebell Hill. There is evidence that the Celts in Chatham traded with Greek merchants and had good relations with them, even though they spoke completely different languages. This image shown is a drawing of a plaque gifted to the Chatham settlers by the Greeks. After about 1,000 years of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age began. With the Iron Age came many migrations with different types of people. First were the Goidels. Little evidence shows that they lived in Kent, but historians suppose they did. The Brythons came next. These people were very good at making jewellery. The image on the left could possibly have been made by them. Lastly were the Belgae, who arrived not long before Julius Caesar. They arrived in 180 to 150 BC. The different tribes of Kent belonged to these people. These tribes were called the Canti. The image on the right is a map of pre-Roman trails into and out of Chatham. Chapter 2. The Romans in Chatham. This part of history is when records started to appear. Places like Varga, Medway, or Kent, Kent, started to appear in records from the time period. This was also a period of time that the Romans started to appear in Britain. The first Roman invasion saw the Romans push up through different Kentish places, but eventually stopping and demanding hostages and money. When they were awarded this, they retreated back to Gaul, France. This all happened in 54 BC. The next invasion happened in 43 AD. This invasion saw the Romans push up to Medway with little to no resistance. When they reached Medway though, the Battle of Medway ensued. The Battle of Medway saw a joint force of the northern tribes. With the Romans too strong though, the tribes were eventually pushed back. With no bridge though, the only way the Romans could get across was by swimming. After the battle in Medway and the conquest of Britain, a permanent camp was set up in Medway. This was proven by many graves being found during construction works. During the construction of Amherst Redoubt in 1779, the foundations of a Roman building were found, and it seemed to have cells in it. This could possibly be more evidence of a Roman camp in Chatham. The Romans also built a bridge across the Medway at the same point the modern-day bridge is today. Watling Street, also known today as the A2, is a Roman road that runs straight through the Medway towns. This street starts in Dover and leads up to London. Then it carries on up to the Welsh border. It was primarily used for the transportation of soldiers. Part of the original Roman road is still visible in a pub named the George of Alts, located in Rochester High Street. Chapter 3. The Saxons in Chatham. After 370 years of Roman rule, in 413 AD, the Roman Empire left Britain. Because of this, Britain was pretty much defenceless. During the later years of the Roman Empire in Britain, Saxons found and raided the southern coast of Britain. It was calculated that the Saxons invaded Britain in 449 AD, 36 years after the Romans left Britain. By 455 AD, the first Kentish king was proclaimed. His name was Hengist. After Hengist gained full control of Kent, all the tribes under his rule started to settle in different places in Kent. The Ceata tribe settled in Medway. The Ceata tribe was named after the saint Ceata. Ceata lived and died in Medway. The tribe also named their land after him. They named it Keteham. Around this time a site emerged. It was known today as Kit's Cotty House. It is four rocks placed together to make a statue. A bit later in history, King Alfred split Kent into two, East and West, Canterbury being the capital of the East and Rochester the capital of the West. He then split them into five laffs, West Kent having Sutton at Home, Aylesford, and the lower part of the Laff of Scray. Aylesford contained four bailiwicks and 13 hundreds. One of the hundreds was the hundred of Chatham and Gillingham. In the division of Kent, Chatham was ranked as a half hundred. This was because Chatham and Gillingham combined was ranked as a hundred. This hundred contained the parish of Chatham, part of Gillingham, and the parish of St. James in the Isle of Grain. Chatham consisted of 500 people. These people were all responsible for the defence, upkeep, and good behaviour of each other. Chatham Church is also known as St. Mary's Church and is located on Dock Road. The first record of Chatham Church was made in 915 AD. There are no records about the creation of the church, so nobody knows when it was made. Chapter 4. The Normans in Chatham. After the Battle of Hastings, England was conquered by William, Duke of Normandy. As soon as he gained control over England, he changed many things. One of the things that he changed was the owner of Chatham. The new owner of Chatham was called Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. He was the half-brother of William. All the original Saxon rulers were degraded, and the people against the Norman rulers were forced to take refuge elsewhere as outlaws. The Domesday Book shows Chatham, which was then known as Keteham, being taxed at 6 shillings. It also says that there are 33 villagers, 4 smallholders, 15 slaves, 20 acres of meadow, 1 mill valued at 2 shillings and 7 pence, 6 fisheries, and 1 church. In 1077, Gundulf was appointed the Bishop of Rochester. Following this, he decided to found a hospital called St. Bartholomew's Hospital. It was the first hospital in England for the poor. At the time, it was a voluntary charity, and it was for most of its time as a hospital. The hospital stood for many years, but in 1862 it was completely rebuilt. St. Bartholomew's Chapel stood adjoining to the hospital and is one of the oldest churches in England. Not much happened in Chatham during the Norman period, and as time went by, the Norman period eventually came to an end after 88 years on the throne. Chapter 5. After the Normans. After the Normans died out, the Plantagenets came to rule. During the time that the Plantagenets were on the throne, Chatham was primarily a farming town. It also had small amounts of trade happening as it was located upon the River Medway. During this period, the Black Death occurred. This caused workforce shortages which massively affected Chatham as its economy was boosted by the farms across its land. In 1381, commissioners were sent to Kent to find out why the poll tax had failed to produce the amount that was expected. During this, an offence against a young girl made her father attack one of the commissioners and kill him. The offence sparked protests in places across Kent. The protests became so big that they decided to march to London and petition the king. Multiple people involved in the march came from the Medway towns. This included Ferrol of Rochester, Thomas Bergstead of Gillingham, and John Goldborn of Renham. The march was disbanded by the order of the king before it reached London, and all the rebels went back to their towns. This rebellion was later called the Wat Tyler Rebellion. Chapter 6. Tudor Chatham. Early Tudor Chatham mainly consisted of only farmland. The only significant thing in Chatham was St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Other than a struggle against feudalism, nothing had bothered the area since the Norman invasion. To the north of Chatham was the city of Rochester, and to the east was Gillingham, which was the other half-hundred in the area that made the hundred of Chatham and Gillingham. During the late 1400s and early 1500s, the shores of Chatham became more and more dedicated to the building and storing of Royal Navy ships and equipment. Gun Wharf is the earliest known building that contributed to these efforts. Once Chatham became related to the Royal Navy, the inhabitants of the town began to change. People with shipbuilding trades started to move to the town, trying to find work at the buildings on the shore. The importance of a naval presence in Chatham was quickly realized by authorities. With this, a site was confirmed for a new Chatham Docks. This site was where Gun Wharf was located. The dock was formed by cutting into the chalk bank and depositing the chalk along the waterfront. This raised the level of shore above the high water mark. This narrow area of levelled foreshore was the beginning of Chatham Dockyard. With the dockyard at Chatham becoming more and more important as the years went by, the Admiralty decided to expand the dockyard for additional anchorage in 1547. Gillingham Waters was selected for the purpose, and a sum of £4,167 was spent on the expansion. This is equivalent to £2,929,300 in today's money. The importance of the dockyard would grow considerably after this, with records showing that between 1548 and 1550, £3,729 was spent on ships anchored in Chatham docks. The threat of invasion was growing a lot during this period of time. Many defence forts were stationed around the coast of England, with the only fort defending the Medway, which was called Queensborough Castle, falling into decay. This fort was soon to be restored with the growing naval presence in Medway. About the same time as this, a blockhouse was built at Sheerness. Evidence for this is shown in an entry of the accounts of AD 1547. In this account it said 8 persons serving at the castle of Queensborough and the blockhouse at Sheerness of Thyall of Sheppey were paid at the rate of 6d. by the day every man. Along with these forts, beacons were set up around the Medway area, so that an alarm could be sounded if an invasion fleet was to sail down the Medway. A beacon was built in which today is the lines. This beacon is the reason Beacon Road in Luton has its name. With the dockyard now fully defended, on the 8th of June 1550, by order of the Council to the Lord Admiral, stated all the King's ships should be harboured in Gillingham Water, saving those that be at Portsmouth, to remain there till the year be further spent for avoiding of all inconveniences, and that all masters of ships, gowners, and pursers be discharged, except a convenient number, till the danger of the year be past, and afterwards to be ordered as it hath been accustomed in time of peace. Chatham Manor is a building that is located in Chatham. It features in a few records made during this time. It is said that Thomas Lord Wentworth succeeded to the manor and was made Deputy of Calais. He was also made the Privy Councillor during the reign of Queen Mary. In 1567, the naval establishment had a headquarters at Chatham. This building was for the superior officers that were stationed at the dockyard. It was later that year that the dockyard was officially called Chatham Dockyard. In 1570, Hill House was used by the Lord Admiral and different navy officers. This made Chatham the chief Elizabethan yard. With the dockyard becoming more and more important and tensions with France and Spain rising, defences were needed to defeat a possible invasion force. A fort was built in Upnor. This is today known as Upnor Castle. A chain ran from Upnor Castle to Chatham. This was to stop any unauthorized ships entering the area in which the dockyard was. The Chatham Chest was set up after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This chest was planned by Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins, and was a chest that sailors could put a certain percentage of their wage into. This would be for the aid of sailors that are in distress from work-related problems. It is currently owned by the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich. Sir John Hawkins Hospital was also founded in the same period of the time as the Chatham Chest. This hospital was founded so that wounded seamen and shipwrights from Chatham could have a place to go, completely free of charge. Chapter 7. The 17th Century. During the first quarter of the 17th century, not much happened in Chatham. Ships were being built at Chatham often, and the dockyard had an expansion. The expansion brought a new dry dock built in 1619, a new mast dock built in 1619, a new sail loft built in 1620, a new rope house built in 1621, new office residences built in 1622, another dry dock built in 1623, and a new graving dock built in 1624. Before this expansion, the dockyard was mainly for repairing and improving vessels, but with this new expansion, many more jobs were given out to the dockyard. With these new jobs, more people were needed. This would mean a rise in population in the local area. Unskilled labourers usually came from the small villages from the nearby towns of Chatham and Gillingham, but the skilled workers usually came from elsewhere. This meant that the towns expanded. The dockyard workforce went from 120 in the 1570s to around 250 in the late 1620s. By 1660, the figure was reaching 800. During this period, King James I visited a few times. Once in 1604 to see the fleet, and again in 1606, where they had dinner on board the Elizabeth Jonas. In 1611, the Prince of Wales visited the dockyard. Pett, who was commissioner of the yard, wrote, "His Highness landed at the old dock at Chatham a little before 6 that night, and thence walked on foot to Mr. Legate's house, where his supper was ready for him prepared, and his train, to his great content." Lastly, King James visited to meet the King of Bohemia, who married his daughter. With the demand for housing rising, the whole of the north side of the brook had been used for residential areas. This, however, was not enough for the rising population. The manor house, held by Phineas Pett, was divided up and sold for building purposes. The old manor house was demolished, and a posting house was erected on where the old manor house stood. This posting house was later known as the Metier Hotel. The drive leading up to the manor was opened up as a public road. The Manor Pound, which was located at the corner of the lane which connected the road to Rochester, was removed. Soon after this removal, the thoroughfare, which we know today to be as the High Street, was opened up along the line now traversed from the Globe Lane. It then connected to the existing main road, which carried on to Canterbury. With the construction of this low-level motorway, Chatham was no longer known to be a dead-end village. People who lived on the coast would now pass through Chatham. Remote villages were often off the map that most travellers owned. With this new motorway, people started to know about the existence of Chatham. During the 1620s and 30s, there was a lot of unrest within the dockyard. Many workers were not paid what they should have been, and they were starting to have to sell their personal belongings just to survive. In 1627, these men marched up to London, where they were promised pay by the treasurer. This promise was not kept. Many upgrades to the dockyard occurred during these times, as the dockyard's command was still loyal to the crown. Many ships were commissioned as well. On the 15th of June 1632, King Charles visited the dockyard to inspect some of his ships. He stayed in the Crown Inn in Rochester. He inspected some more ships the next day. During the English Civil War, Chatham was parliamentarian, with most of its population angered by what was occurring at the dockyard. The people of Chatham were obviously pleased to hear that the parliamentarians won the war, and they were expecting the pay that they deserved. This pay, however, did not come. The men of Chatham were fed up with no pay, and thus rioted and ended up seizing multiple ships in the dockyard. This rebellion would eventually fizzle out after parliamentarian forces demanded that they ended the rebellion. Chapter 8. The Raid on the Medway. After the end of the Commonwealth in 1660, Charles II rose to the throne. Soon after this, in 1664, England went to war with Holland. For most of the war, England was humiliated over and over again. Many of England's American colonies, like New England and Virginia, were invaded and became New Amsterdam and New York. Most of this humiliation was because of how unprepared England was and how Parliament would not allow enough money to be spent on the war. Sir Peter Pett, son of Phineas Pett and second commissioner of Chatham Dockyard, reported, "Of discipline there seems to be none, the workmen apparently keeping their own times and doing as little or as much work as they pleased." A fort had been built in Gillingham, on the bank of the River Medway, for defence of the yard and the navy. This fort was not manned well, and only had 4 guns during the raid. On Monday the 10th of June 1667, the fort at Sheerness Dockyard had been destroyed by a Dutch invasion force. Forces of soldiers marched up to Sheerness, but nothing could stop the massive invasion force the Dutch had planned. Alarm bells were ringing at the dockyard. On Wednesday the 12th of June 1667, the Dutch continued to sail up the Medway. They soon reached Gillingham, where they destroyed the fort with no effort. They then reached the defensive chain, which went from Hooness to Gillingham. The chain was defended by multiple ships from the dockyard, but the chain turned out to be in much worse condition than the Elizabethan chain, and it was too light for its purpose, weighing a mere 14 to 15 tons. It was nothing compared to the 1 to 2,000-ton ships. The chain eventually disappeared. It is unclear whether or not it broke or was forced under the water. At this point the tide turned, so the Dutch anchored and waited for the next day. During the time that the Dutch were anchored, the British set up cannons in the dockyard, ready to defend. By this point, 3 ships had already been sunk: the St. George, the Royal Catherine, and the Victory. The next day the Dutch continued with their mission. They burnt down an extra 3 ships. They then captured a 4th ship and set sail back to Holland. After these events, it was learnt that on Wednesday Dutch forces had landed at Gillingham. This was the first time that an enemy force had landed on British soil since 1066. It was also the first time an enemy force had sailed up the Medway since the Viking raids. The humiliation was horrid. Commissioner Pett was arrested on the 17th on charges of seditious practices and misdemeanours, and was sent to the Tower of London. He would stay there for 3 days until he was released on the bail of £5,000, about £1,009,062 in today's money, and was soon restored to office. After the raid, it was clear that Chatham needed much better organisation and defence. For this reason, many actions were taken to make sure that Chatham would not face such a raid in the future. They would convert Upnor Castle into a gun magazine. They would create a regiment named the Maritime Regiment of Foot, and they would make sure that all workmen in the dockyard were paid fairly and properly. All of this obviously worked, as there was no raids on the Medway after. By this time, Chatham had become a town. There was no sign of the old village, and nobody would have been able to tell that just 200 years ago Chatham was barely a village. All the old buildings had been knocked down, and their grounds were converted into areas like posting houses and banks. The people of Chatham were also quite different to the people who lived around them. Although they had no proper traditions, they tend to speak differently, using words like blimey, coo, and yus, rather than words like mercy, and I, which were used by the people from the towns around them, like Maidstone and Rainham. Chatham would also grow in size massively during the 17th century. One main part that grew a lot was the High Street. By the end of the century, the High Street was a very busy shopping centre, which was constantly being visited by horses and wagons. Chapter 9. The 18th Century. With the 18th century came lots of changes for Chatham. Some changes early on in the century include the Marines being stationed at Chatham for the defence of the dockyard against any invasion force, as the country would still have been recovering from the humiliation of the Dutch-English War. Another thing is that with the rise of population, a cricket team was formed in Chatham. Records show that a match was played on the 24th of July 1705. This is known in records as the first notice of a Kentish cricket match. John, Duke of Argyll, would also receive the title Baron of Chatham. This title, however, would become extinct after his death, as he had no male heir. During the 18th century, an extreme threat of invasion was apparent. For this reason, the forts in the Medway and the Thames were heavily fortified, because Britain did not want a repeat of the raid on the Medway. Many regiments and militias were sent to the south coast ready for invasion. George Wade was in charge of many of these regiments. In the charge of the French was Marshal Saxe. At the end of February 1744, a French invasion force appeared in the Channel. Not realizing the readiness of the southern coast, they retreated back to France. During the 1740s, land was purchased by the Crown, and by 1756, plans for some new fortifications were prepared. Many historical buildings were demolished, like Hill House and an ancient street that ran through Chatham. A few years later, in 1758, more land was purchased. Large barracks for soldiers in Chatham were erected. The people of Chatham did not like this. Many farmers and residents did not like how many fortifications were being built near their houses. On the 14th of July 1758, an order was sent to Chatham Dockyard for the building of 12 ships. One of these ships would be known as the HMS Victory. Her building was part of a massive shipbuilding programme presented to the House of Commons by Pitt the Elder, who was the Earl of Chatham. Thomas Slade was the senior designer for her. She would be laid down on July of 1759 and was named HMS Victory in 1762. The length of her keel would be 259 feet and her displacement would be around 3,556 tons. She would cost about £150,000 to build, around £24,567,402 today. She was launched on the 7th of May 1765 and would be known as one of the best and most influential ships in history. During this time, the title Earl of Chatham was created and was given to William Pitt the Elder. He would devote a lot of his time into the growth of Chatham and the good of the people who lived there. He would also fight a lot for the Chatham in Parliament. In 1770, residents of Chatham applied for an Act to pass. This Act would allow the construction of a road from Chatham to Rochester. This road was constructed so that people trying to get from Chatham to Rochester would not have to go through the busy High Street, and would rather just go on a road around the High Street. Funds were raised for this road, and in 1779 the road's foundations were set. This road would later be known as New Road. Also in 1770, Horatio Nelson wandered through the streets of Chatham, not knowing that the ship he would use in the future to defeat the French navy was launched there not many years before. While in Chatham, he was spotted by a Royal Navy officer. This officer put Nelson on board his uncle's ship. Because of this, Nelson made his first contact with the service which he would devote his life to. At Medway, Nelson would learn the rudiments of his profession and would be taught the basics of being a Royal Navy officer. In 1782, a writer wrote about Brompton. He said that on the chalk hill lies the village of Brompton, situated partly in the parish of Chatham and partly in that of Gillingham, consisting of 400 houses, most of which had been erected within the memory of persons now living. This village grew greatly over the years, with it mainly being connected with the military. During the 18th century, a spacious building was erected for the poor in Chatham. It was situated at the east of the High Street and was paid for by donations. This building would be known as the Medway Union. Its premises fronted the High Street and extended back to New Road. On the site now stands the Gala Bingo Hall. During this time, Gregory's Charity was also founded. This charity would help supply the homeless with food and shelter. Chapter 10: The Napoleonic Wars. In 1770, plans for the dockyard fortifications had been remodelled by Lieutenant General Skinner. Between 1775 and 1780, Hill House was pulled down as the site was where the new barracks was to be built. Fort Amherst was built between 1779 and 1782, then Fort Clarence, which was built in 1812, then Fort Pitt, which was built in 1819. The other forts were built later on. Marines have been present in Chatham for most of the dockyard's history, but the first time an actual marine barracks was built was around the time of the construction of Fort Amherst. The first barracks was officially instituted in 1792. From this point on, marine presence in Chatham continued to grow. The barracks would close in 1950. Some barracks was built between 1804 and 1806. The barracks would soon be taken over by the recently formed Royal Engineers, which were formed in 1772. The barracks would be turned into a school of military engineering. The men who graduated from the school would be known as the Royal Sappers and Miners. The school and barracks are still open today. Chapter 11: The 19th Century. In 1816, John Dickens moved to Chatham after receiving instructions to join the Navy Pay Office at Chatham. The family more than likely lived in lodgings until the mid-1870s, when they moved into No. 2 Ordnance Street. Charles Dickens moved into Chatham with John, and most of his childhood was spent there. Some of his books were based off of places in the Medway towns. During the 19th century, major expansions happened at the dockyard. The dockyard at the start of the century only reached the length of what is today Dock Road. By the end of the century, though, the dockyard was pretty much double in size and reached up to St. Mary's Island and continued to follow the coast and reach what is today the Strand Leisure Park. With the expansion came a major increase in dockyard activity and workers, and with an increase in dockyard workers came an increase in residents in Chatham. As residents in Chatham increased, Chatham became bigger and bigger, with the economy growing with it. With the expansion of the dockyard, it might come to a surprise that the defences were not expanded much. With the improvement of technology, Fort Amherst pretty much became obsolete, with the ground being used for the training of Marines. Minor improvements were made throughout the century. The Municipal Reform Act of 1835 recorded a lot of data about Chatham. Records show that in the year 1838, the streets that Chatham consisted of are listed in the picture. There were also many public houses or pubs that were dotted around Chatham. Many of these are no longer open. These pubs are listed in the picture. There were also records of many more schools, churches, and shops. The Municipal Reform Act paved the way for the establishment of a local government. A local board of health would also be established under the Public Health Act of 1848. With the founding of the council came many more improvements to the local area. This included a new drainage system which ran through the town. By the late 19th century, many more places were built. A lot of them still survive today. Many more streets were built, the names of which are listed in a picture. New fire stations were built, including Chatham Volunteer Fire Brigade and Luton Road Fire Station. Some pier was erected in 1886, and the number of electors increased from 760 to 4,518 people. The population of Chatham was recorded to be at 48,800 people. This was evidence of the massive expansion of the town, as the population was much less not that long before. Chapter 12: The 20th Century. In the early 20th century, a few upgrades to the dockyard occurred. This would include the establishment of the HMS Pembroke, which was founded in 1903. This new barracks would house up to 5,000 sailors and would be made up of wooden walls of what was HMS Pembroke, the ship. The Naval Hospital was opened in 1905 and would be open to all the wounded and sick sailors in the dockyard. This hospital would stay open until 1961, when it was handed over to the Ministry of Health. It is still open today as a public hospital. A few memorials would also be erected. This included the Naval War Memorial in 1922. This was built to remember many different sailors who fought and died in World War One. During World War One, Chatham didn't have much involvement in the war. Many men went to fight and sadly many died. Chatham Dockyard was not very active because of how most of the fleet was sent up the Scapa Flow to fight the German fleet. The Chatham Marines fought in a few battles, including Zeebrugge raid in 1980 and at Gallipoli. A few air raids happened over Chatham as well, including the air raid on the Chatham Drill Hall. The main role of Chatham Dockyard during the war was to build ships for the fleet, but because most of the men were sent off to fight in the war, women were recruited at the dockyard for the first time in history. During World War Two, Chatham pretty much had the same job that they did in World War One. They were to build ships for the war effort. Chatham, having 3 military bases, was a target for Nazis and was bombed quite regularly. Winston Churchill even said that Chatham was a nodal point to be defended at all costs. For this reason, Fort Amherst was reopened and was used as a base to help the town when bombed. People close to the fort could go there for cover, and military personnel could dispatch emergency response to certain areas of the town in case of bombing. After World War Two, Chatham would recover and soon enough become as big as a military centre than it was before. Residents of Chatham would also be very interested in the military side. Events called Navy Days would happen where people could enter the dockyard and look around it and the ships that were in it. This didn't only happen in Chatham, as it happened in all the other major dockyard towns as well. Chatham would continue to build ships and was a major dockyard once it had recovered. In 1962, the last Royal Navy ship would be launched from Chatham. It was named HMS Ocelot and is now a museum ship at Chatham Historic Dockyard. 2 other ships would be made for the Canadian Navy after this. From that point on, the dockyard's importance went on a downward slope. This was until on the 25th of June 1981 it was announced in Parliament that the dockyard would close. A few years later, on the 30th of March 1984, the dockyard closed after 400 years of Royal Navy connections. With the closure of the dockyard came major economic difficulties in Chatham. Unemployment rates skyrocketed as over 1,700 people lost their jobs due to the closure. The economy would not get better for a long time. Regeneration started to take place 15 to 20 years after the closure, with many parts of the dockyard becoming housing, roads and shops. A few examples are Dockside, which is now a shopping centre, and St. Mary's Island, which is a housing estate. We now come to the modern era, and this is where I'll finish this video. On the screen you can see all the sources I used to get the information for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, as I did spend quite a long time on this.